The pines held the light like a secret, needled branches, whispering as a breeze slipped through and vanished. Tommy moved with his chin tucked and his shoulders forward, the canvas tote knocking lightly against his hip, the scent of wet sap and leaf mold rising with each step. He had come for pine cone, for the soft brown spirals his mother would wire into a wreath. But the forest had pulled him deeper than he meant to go. A buried stick snapped beneath his sneaker and the crack rang too loud, like a word shouted in a church. He paused. The silence rearranged itself around him, a living thing. Then he heard it, not a bird, not the neat tap of a woodpecker, a low sound, human and rough, like someone trying to speak with a mouth full of gravel. He held his breath. The sound came again, a broken groan from somewhere ahead and to the left, but the trunks threw it around until direction felt like a trick. Tommy stepped toward it. Then again, parting ferns with his knees. The air had a cold green taste. He touched a trunk to steady himself, and felt the bark catch his palm like sandpaper. The ground dipped, and a little clearing opened, more a pause in the forest than a true meadow. At its center stood an oak, with a trunk as wide as a kitchen table, gnarled roots like fingers gripping the soil. At first, the shape at the base of the oak looked like gear someone had ditched, a slump of leather and denim and shadow. Then the shape breathed, a shiver that made metal whisper. A head lifted barely an inch. The face that turned toward him was a map of dried blood and swelling, one eye puffed half shut, the other a glassy coin of fear and stubbornness. The man was enormous. Even slumped, he made the space feel small. Chains looped the oak and cinched his wrists behind the trunk, so tight the bark beneath had been scoured pale. Tommy stopped again. Every rule adults ever pressed into him woke up at once, hot and busy. The leather vest on the man's chest carried an arch of stitched letters like he had seen in bad news stories, the kind that made grown men cross the street. The sight put a weight in Tommy's belly. But the man's eyes were not the eyes from posters. They were tired and human and fixed on the canteen at Tommy's hip like it was a cup of rain in a drought. Most kids would have run. The thought flitted through him and was gone. The man's lips were chalked with dryness. When he swallowed, the sound was a dry click, leaf against leaf. Tommy eased the tote to the ground. His hands shook as he unscrewed the dented cap of his metal canteen. The threads squealed a little. The man flinched at the noise and then dragged his focus to the boy. "It is okay," Tommy said, and even his whisper felt big here. "It is water." The man's jaw worked. Tommy stepped in close enough to smell the iron of blood under sweat and leather and earth. He tipped the canteen, the first cold mouthful missed, and ran down the man's chin, beating bright on the vest, before sliding off. The second found his mouth. The man swallowed like every muscle had to pull its own weight, then exhaled a wobbling breath that carried the shape of thanks. Tommy hesitated, then pressed the canteen gently into the man's bound hand, where it lay against the curve of the trunk. The chain would not let the hand rise, but the fingers found the canteen and curled around the cylinder. The metal was cold against beaten skin, bright cold against the dull cold of the chain that cut his wrist. For a moment Tommy saw the two metals together, his and theirs, simple and clear as a picture in a schoolbook. His canteen metal said, "Help." The chain metal said, "Hurt." He wanted the first to be louder. "How long have you been here?" he asked, and then wished he had not shaped it like a question. The man's head moved a fraction. Long enough. Tommy's sneaker nudged something and sent it skittering. He looked down. The small rock he had kicked rolled to a stop against the root. Just beyond it, on the curve of the oak, where the soil held prints, he saw a faint smear of red paint dried into a thin tongue, not blood red but the chalky red of a garage floor line. Near it lay the ghost of a boot tread that was not his. a long oval with an odd curve through the middle, as if a snake had passed. The smear and the print felt recent, like breath that had not yet cooled. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and for a heartbeat he wanted very much to be back where the path was wide and the sky open. He kept the canteen in place instead. The man tried to shift, and the chain nicked bark. The tiny sound was fierce in the quiet. "I will get help," Tommy said. "I am going to call." He backed toward the fringe of the clearing until the branches brushed his shoulder. He dug in his pocket and brought up the old flip phone with lint clinging to the hinge. He flipped it open. The tired blue light came up through a spider web of cracks. The little signal bars showed a pair of hopeful marks. He pressed the numbers for the emergency line. The ones adults repeated like a prayer. The ring sounded thin. He waited. A woman's voice arrived, calm even in its first breath, asking for his emergency and his name, and if he was safe. He said the words he needed to say. "There is a man. He is chained to a tree in the woods. He is bleeding. My name is Tommy. I am okay. He is not." He gave the road name the way his father had taught him to talk to maps, with landmarks, with the broken corner of the Miller sign. The woman typed. He could hear it under her voice and told him help was coming. She asked him to stay on the road, to wait where they could find him. He looked at the man. The man's good eye had slid closed again, and his breath had become shallow and exact. Tommy felt a rope pull inside him, tugging in two directions. The road was a sprint away through the trees. The instructions were simple and safe. Leave now. Wait there. Be a good boy on the edge of the world. He stared at the chain and at the hand, holding his canteen like a relic. He could not make his feet choose the road. "I will keep him company," Tommy said. The voice on the phone tightened. She began to say his name again. He meant to answer. The phone flickered. The cracked screen went pale, then shot a line of light like a small lightning, and then the light drained away. It was not him closing it. It died in his hand with a soft sigh from the speaker. His lifeline winked out and left only trees. For a second, he stood there with the dead plastic in his palm, and the whisper of needles above, sounding like water he could not drink. "Not you hanging up," he thought. The phone left first. "Now it is just you and your choice." He folded the useless phone and slid it away like a pebble that could not help. Then he walked back into the clearing. He returned because it felt like a kind of promise. He returned because leaving would have been louder in his head than siren. Up close again, he could hear the man's breath and the soft catch in it. He could see the patches on the vest, embroidered arcs. Wings, symbols he did not know. His gaze skimmed the big arch that made his stomach knot, and then caught on a smaller square of stitching near the collar, splayed and a little frayed at the edge, as if fingers had worried it over years. It meant something, that little square. He did not know what yet. He filed it into the careful drawer, where he kept bug names and bird colors, and the way his father said the valves would always sing if you listened right. "We called," Tommy said, though the phone lay dead and dumb. "They are coming. Do you want more water?" The man fought his eyelids open, focused, and found the boy. Surprise flickered through his grimace. A quick light. "You came back," he said. The words dragged over stones. Tommy nodded, because nodding felt sturdy. "I could not leave." He tipped the canteen again. The man leaned forward the width of a breath and caught the pour. When the water touched his split lip, he made a sound that was half curse and half relief. The canteen settled once more into his palm, the cylinder cool against the ridge of chain, metal against metal, help against harm. "Does the chain hurt a lot?" Tommy asked, and then blushed, because the answer sat in front of him, in purple swelling and white pinch marks. The man made a rough sound that might have been a laugh if it had not been so cracked. "Hurts," he said. "Been worse." The ants along the oak's root marched in a straight brown line, carrying pale scraps. One ant found the bead of water that had fallen from the man's chin and splayed its legs to sip. Tommy watched it for a heartbeat and felt a small, strange steadiness. Work continues. Avon here. He glanced toward the path. Was that a distant whine, or only the forest making its own music? He held still. The sound rose a shade, thin at first and then thicker, as if pulled on a string. Sirens live in the air now, he thought, and the thought put heat behind his ribs. Do you hear that? He asked. The man listened, his jaw set for a beat. Then he nodded once. Relief unspooled in Tommy like a knot being worked gently until the rope lay open. He stepped a little toward the edge of the clearing so that when the first people burst through the brush, they would see the man's face and the chain and the canteen, not just leather and rumor. He could already feel the presence of others in the way the birds went quiet. Voices reached them, clipped and careful. Branches cracked. Light flickered between trunks, the bright vests of paramedics ghosting through the green-like flags. "Are you okay, Mr.?" Tommy started, and then stopped because the name had not been given. The man's mouth tugged into the beginning of a smile and let it go. "You did good," the man said. His voice had found a lower place where it could stand. Tommy's cheeks warmed. He put himself half a step closer to the man as the first uniform shouldered into the open, not to hide, but to mark out a frame. He wanted the deputy to see a boy standing beside a hurt person, not danger in a vest. He wanted the story in that first glance to be the right story. His body chose for him, a small shift toward the chain, a small shield against the first lazy judgment. "Here," he called, and his voice filled the clearing without cracking. "He is here." The deputy stopped short for the blink of a heartbeat, recalibrating. Then he moved, hand up in a steadying gesture. The paramedics right behind with bolt cutters, and a bag that smelled sharp and clean, even from where Tommy stood. The forest exhaled with them, air moving, orders landing, adult hands making quick shapes. Tommy felt the man's attention on him even as other faces closed in. He kept his place, canteen at the ready, the cold cylinder in his hand, a small banner in a small battle. The chains whispered one more time, like a bad idea letting go. The ride to the hospital unspooled in a blur of sirens, and thin blue light reflected off windows, a stitched pattern of sky and steel, and the chemical sharpness of antiseptic braided with diesel. Tommy sat between his parents in the waiting area that tried to disguise itself as something kinder, with beige chairs and a silent television mouthing headlines. No one could hear. His mother put her arm around him, took it away, and then put it back, the rhythm as restless as the sweep of the second hand on the wall clock. His father held the canvas tote of pine cones like it was a fragile animal that had fallen asleep in his hands. Nurses in soft shoes passed with quick purpose, their voices kept low, as if the air itself had rules. A name floated out of that current and hooked him. "Marcus Mackenzie," said a nurse with a tablet, and then she added a word that moved the whole sentence into a narrower corridor. "Intensive." The corridor they entered smelled like determination, the particular promise to kill anything small that might do harm. Light fell in a pale green wash that made edges look sharper than they were. Floors shone so clean that faces floated on them like reflections in a slow river. Machines in distant rooms kept time by beeps, a conversation of small metal hearts speaking to each other through walls. A nurse with her hair coiled into a neat knot met them at a station rimmed with notes and pens. Her badge read Patricia, and her smile was the kind that made children feel like their names had been remembered. "Peterson family?" she asked. and when his mother nodded, the nurse pitched her voice gentle. "He is stabilized," she said. He asked if the boy was all right. Tommy felt the inside of his chest steady, a small platform lowering into place. His father's hand tightened once on the tote strap and then was still. "There are a lot of machines," Nurse Patricia said. "He looks rough, but he is awake in pieces. You can say hello for a few minutes." Before the heavy doors opened, she turned to a small printer on the counter. It chirped and produced a square badge, glossy and warm, with big block letters and a row of smaller words beneath. She peeled the backing and pressed it onto Tommy's jacket near the zipper. The adhesive felt like a small, warm palm. The badge read "Visitor," and then his name, and then room 314. And below that, a time spelled in the dry note of officialness. 9/14/22. She tapped her tablet and those same words glowed there. Anit Echo. She lifted the tablet and took a quick picture of the three of them against a white cinder block wall. It was not a photo for strangers. It belonged to a file that lived behind passwords and approvals. A rubber stamp thudded on paper somewhere nearby. A thick, clean sound. The moment lifted its head and let itself be recorded. The doors sighed and let them in. The temperature slid down a notch. The room they entered had two windows, one onto the hall and one framing a square of winter sky. Machines stood near the bed like quiet relatives in formal clothes. Lines looped from clear bags to a man whose face bore the bright fingerprints of harder hands. "Razor," Tommy said, the name a careful test of whether it could stay together in this room full of machines. The man's head turned toward the sound. His good eye found the boy and held him. The corners of his mouth tugged upward. His lips had more color now, less chalk. "Hey kid," Razor said. The sound came from lower in his chest now, not out of the scraped place in his throat. It still rasped, but it did not break. Tommy walked to the rail and stopped. He did not bounce or fidget. He put his hands in his jacket pockets, because it helped them remember how to be calm. His mother stood at his shoulder. His father stood near the foot of the bed with the tote that looked out of place next to stainless steel. "We brought flowers," Tommy said, and the words sounded too big for a second, so he let them settle into the air. Nurse Patricia took the bright bundle and eased it into a plastic pitcher by the sink. The room changed a little, a small sun of yellow in a sea of blue and white. "You came," Razor said. It was not a question, only a recognition. "Are you okay?" Tommy asked, even as wires and bruises formed their own answers. He wanted to say something true, and not small. "I will be," Razor said, "because you did not leave me to argue with a tree." Tommy let that sit inside him, warm as a held cup. He looked at the chair by the wall where the leather vest had been set aside. It no longer owned the space. It slouched over the back, like any jacket discarded by a tired person. The big arch of letters grinned upward, and his eyes slid beneath it to the smaller square near the collar, a patch he had only glimpsed in the woods. The light here was better. The stitches were a flat silver rubbed by time. The edges were fretted by fingers that had found them without thinking. The letters were plain and they said, "Ranger." The sight of it moved through him like a stone dropping through water, an impact that kept traveling. Ranger meant soldier. Soldier meant laws and oaths and a chain of promises that did not break even when you were far away from where you had first made them. The secret stood up in the room and chose him. He felt the weight of that choice settle on his shoulders. A bearable weight, but real. It made the story more complicated. It made his place in it heavier. He understood, in a way that did not require adult words, that he was not just protecting a man from a chain. He was standing with someone who had once stood with others under a different banner. The boy did not only see a name, he saw a promise that had been mangled and needed a hand to lift it again. No one else saw it. His mother watched Nurse Patricia's hands as she adjusted a line, memorizing the grace with which she moved. His father's eyes traveled over the floor, noticing the faint ladder of scuffs, where a gurney had done the same journey again and again. Adults looked at the habits of a room, at the grooves worn in by use. Neither of them looked at the vest on the chair. The secret was a small square of cloth in a world of wires and forms. It belonged, for now, to Tommy alone. That was the point and the pressure. The nurse made another small note, and the tablet flashed their badge image again. The words, "Visitor" and Tommy Peterson, and room 314, and the time 9:14:22, stamped under like a neat footnote. The numbers were not just words on plastic. When the badge had pressed warm to his jacket, he had felt the heat of it through the fabric as if the time itself had burned into him. It was not only the time he had stepped through a door, it was the time his version of the story had been taken in and placed where systems could see it. The first formal moment, the first official line, he did not know to call it a kind of prophecy, but it felt like that, a small fire laid under wood that would catch later when the air found it. The doctor leaned in with a careful face and spoke the language of injuries and outcomes to the man in the bed, and a cleaned-up version to the adults at the rail. A map drawn in soft pencil. Razor listened and said, yes, when yes was what would move the day forward. When the doctor left, Razor looked at the boy again with that steady soldier focus that did not need a badge to exist. Thank you for letting him come, Razor said to the parents, as if the boy belonged to a country with borders and visas. Sarah answered that they wanted to check on him and stopped herself from saying safe, and then shook her head once, because safe did not fit this room, no matter who wore what. Jim said, you do not owe us anything, and then said nothing more because there are times when words can become walls. Nurse Patricia touched a line and checked a number only she could see and nodded. Time, she said softly. In the intensive rooms, time is something you spend and count. Tommy climbed onto the visitor chair so that his chin rose above the rail. He saw, close up, the neat dark stitch marks marching across a cheek like a train track to the other side of a hurt. He saw where someone had combed dried blood out of hair and clipped around the rest. He could see how the skin under the chain would look, even though it was hidden now, white and angry, where metal had pressed. Are all the angels like you? He asked, and he meant the vest, and he meant something larger than patches and leather. Razor's mouth tilted into a wary smile. We are a lot of things, he said. Some of us are soldiers, and some of us are teachers and mechanics and fathers and fools. The vest means you owe people. That is the part I remember. Tommy looked one more time at that small silver square at the collar. He slid its meaning into the same private drawer where he had kept the forest, and the sound of the chain whispering against bark and the way the water had run down a chin and darkened a root. He did not show the drawer to anyone. He did not need to. Secrets can be kept without being hidden from yourself. Nurse Patricia came alongside and checked the shaped light of a monitor. We are going to let him rest, she said, which was a polite way of talking about medicine that would lower pain like a curtain. Would you like to leave anything? She asked, looking to the boy. It was not a trap. It was an invitation to place something on the table of this day that would still be there when the man opened his eyes again. Tommy lifted the canteen he still carried, the metal clean where his palm had polished it, and scuffed where Forrest had knocked it. He set it on the nightstand beside the hospital water cup. The canteen sat there modestly, a scratched cylinder among bags and pumps, and a machine that hummed like a refrigerator does at night. It looked like it did not belong, and yet it became the only thing that looked like hope. It waited, silver and stubborn, for the next small fight it could help with. It was not a souvenir. It was a promise with weight. "I will come back," Tommy said, because a promise needed to be made where machines could hear it. "I will be here," Razor said, and he said it like a man who had learned long ago how to turn a sentence into a vow. In the hall, the air warmed by a shade. Nurse Patricia peeled the visitor badge off his jacket and pressed it onto a grid on a clipboard with other little names and times. A garden of proof. She stamped a log, and the sound landed with a satisfying solidity. On her screen, the words "Visitor" and "Tommy Peterson" and "Room 314 and 91422" appeared again, a chorus that would not lose the tune. They walked back toward the lobby under lights that hummed. A cart rolled by with a soft rattle. Somewhere an elevator chimed in the key of ordinary. Tommy looked at his hands and saw a moon of dried clay under one thumbnail, the same color as the oak's exposed root. He liked that the forest still clung to him. He liked that the hospital and the woods now lived together on his skin. The lobby caught them and poured sunlight over their shoulders through high glass. The television above the quiet coffee stand had found its voice again. It spoke about a rumored motorcycle gathering. The headline used words like concern and coordination, and a bar of red crawled along the bottom with places and opinions. Behind the anchor flashed still images. For a breath, the screen showed a leather vest from a different angle than his chair picture. It looked like every leather vest, and like one in particular. A little tear near a shoulder seam showed white threads that he did not remember seeing in the wood. The picture was blurred, and to anyone else it was content, a symbol of a type of man. To him it was a reminder and a signal. A flare at the edge of a field he had not yet walked. The gathering would not only be thank yous. The air under the image carried the faint smell of a different kind of intention, something that looked back toward the woods with its teeth showing. "Do you want to go home?" his mother asked. "We can bring dinner to Grandma and rest." "Can we leave the canteen here?" Tommy asked, though he had already set it down, though the question was really a hope dressed as courtesy. "We will keep it by his bed," Nurse Patricia said, who had walked into their moment exactly when they needed her to. "Room 314. Nightstand. Metal canteen. Noted," she added, tapping the air as if writing the words directly into it. They stepped into the pale outdoors. The wind smelled like winter grass and gasoline and something warm that had not completely left the afternoon. Tommy climbed into the truck and watched the hospital fall smaller in the mirror. A white block with green windows that now held not just a man, but a small square of silver thread near a collar and a little cylinder of stubborn metal waiting among machines. The road home ran like it always had, but every telephone pole seemed to have a companion shadow beside it. A shape of chain looped round a trunk, and a boy standing a half-step closer to a stranger than anyone expected. He tucked that picture beside the badge and the stamp sound and the silver patch and let it ride there, steadying him somewhere just ahead. In a room with wood and smoke and men with hard hands and complicated hearts, a decision waited like a gavel on a scarred table. The boy did not know the word for that yet. He only knew that secrets travel faster when shared between the right people, and that the first person who would hear his was a man who already carried a patch that taught him how to keep them. Evening came down in a slow gray sheet, soft enough to see through and heavy enough to feel. The hospital lights faded behind the truck as if swallowed by the pines, and the county road shouldered them home with a steady hum. Tommy sat quiet with the seatbelt snug across his chest, feeling the ghost warmth of the visitor badge where the adhesive had touched his jacket. It was gone now, but the sense of being witnessed remained, like a handprint cooling on fabric. In the garage, the air held oil and iron and the shy sweetness of old sawdust. His father set the canvas tote on the bench and brushed away needles that had hitchhiked home. Inside, the kitchen pretended to be ordinary. The refrigerator hummed. The clock ticked with its small, stubborn heart. His mother lifted the kettle with both hands. As if steadiness could be poured, the television whispered from the living room. A reporter spoke with the calm, rounded vowels of someone coaxing a nervous town. Rumors of a motorcycle gathering scrolled along her words, like a nervous ribbon. Graphics slid into place, then dissolved, polite as ushers. Then an image held a beat longer than the rest. A leather vest leaned against a bar polished by 1,000 elbows. Thread glinted, where low red light found it. At the seam near the shoulder, not the shoulder he knew from the woods, a tear had been cut and stitched with coarse black thread, the kind of black that refuses to blend. It looked like a wound that had been mended without love. Not a scrape from a fall, a deliberate slice. A message sewn shut. The anchor moved on. A map replaced the vest, arrows flowing like red fish across state line. Words like coordination and community leaders and traffic plans tried to stand up straight and look brave. Tommy drifted closer to the screen, not for the map but for the afterimage of that seam. He had seen cuts like that on bicycle tires, when someone taught a bully how to whisper without speaking. A cut that says, "We remember," a cut that says, "Come and see." He lowered the volume until the news became a voice in another room. In that soft murmur he could still hear a sound beneath the words, a tremor, like distant engines rolling over a hill. You cannot see yet. At the table he pulled his spiral notebook and opened to a clean page that smelled faintly of pencil dust. He wrote, "Dear Angels," and the space after the words opened like a door waiting to be used. He looked at his mother in the doorway with the kettle, and at his father folding a dish towel once and then again, hands neat on habit. His father did not look up when he said, "Say what you mean. Do not chase what you think they want. Say what you mean and mean it." When he did look up, the words found Tommy's eyes and settled there like stones in a pocket. Tommy wrote what he meant. He thanked them for coming to say thank you. He told them the town was scared and that fear could be wrong about people, the way fog can be wrong about the shape of a tree. He asked them, in plain words, to be extra kind so the town could learn the right outline. He told them that water had helped once, and that kindness worked like water, finding its way through tight places and making them wider. His father's phone trembled on the counter like a small insect. The number did not belong to a name. Unknown city. Not their city. His mother held the kettle without pouring, as if any tilt would tip the whole house. "Answer," she said, "because sometimes instruction is its own comfort." His father answered, and his voice put on its careful jacket. "Peterson." He listened, eyes on the laminate, eyes on his wife, eyes on his son, as if the right word might be printed somewhere in the kitchen. He said yes only once. Then he extended the phone to Tommy, palm up, as if offering a coin. "For you," he said. The phone felt heavier than it should. Tommy balanced it between his ear and his shoulder, the way he did when it mattered not to drop anything. "Hey kid," Razor said, and the gravel in his voice had been rinsed by rest. "How are you holding up?" "I am okay," Tommy said, and it was nearly true. The day had stretched thin without tearing. "Good," Razor said. "I wanted you to hear from me before pieces start arriving from other mouths." He paused, and in that pause, another room breathed into the line. Air moved through vents. Glass touched wood. A deep voice not meant for him said a half-sentence that smelled like planning. Razor covered the receiver and spoke aside, returning with focus sharpened. "My brothers know what you did," he said. "They are not the kind of men who let that slide. They want to ride in and shake your hand." "How many?" Tommy asked, and the question looked at fear without inviting it in. "A lot," Razor said, and quiet pride climbed onto the word, "enough to make a sound that will be heard right." We will do this right. We will not give anyone a reason to tell the wrong story. The sentence tried to dress itself as reassurance, but the way it stood made another shape visible behind it. This was not the voice of someone planning a celebration. It was the voice of someone setting a line, building a fence before a storm, preparing for a match, while telling the field it is only a picnic. He was not lying. He was leaving some truth unlit. Will they be kind? Tommy asked. They will be what you ask. Razor said, I will show them your words. You have my word. Tommy thought of the small silver square near the collar and the way a promise can become a beam you balance on. Thank you, he said. He wanted to tell Razor about the vest on the screen. The cut that had been sewn shut with thread you could see from across a room, the way the picture smelled like trouble that knew its own name. He held it, not because he was afraid, but because he felt the weight of what belonged where. And this piece felt like it should be set down in person between men who understood that one stitch can start a war if someone wants it to. Tell your folks, Razor said, that I owe them for raising a boy who knows how to stand still when running would be easier. He spoke aside again to someone else. Words quick and quiet, a cadence like orders carried without rank. We will do this right, he repeated, softer now, as if laying the sentence like a plank. After the call, the house returned to its small sounds. The refrigerator, the kettle's settled click, a car coasting past with its tires whispering to dry pavement. His mother set a mug in front of him without speaking. It was the mug with the thin silver band at the lip, his mug, and no one else's. The one his grandmother had found at a church sale and said, this one for brave mornings. He did not drink yet. He just looked at it. In a world about to wobble, small circles become anchors. His father came to the table and sat with the way men sit when they have decided not to pace. Men coming, he said, not a question. Tommy nodded. He pictured pairs of headlights sewing a line down the highway, gas stations nodding them through, diners pouring coffee into hands that had known cold, truckers raising 2 fingers from wheel to cap. He pictured the vest on the screen again, the rough black stitches, the way a cut can be both wound and message. Not Razor's, but an answer meant for someone like him. The serpents did not need to be named to be felt. They had already moved in the story like a shadow just beyond the hedge. Will they scare people? His mother asked, careful with the word they, as if fear were a separate animal, not a person. Maybe at first, Tommy said. Maybe until they see how water works. He folded his letter and slid it into an envelope. He did not lick it. He pressed along the flap with the flat of his thumb, like sealing a promise with a touch. His father tucked it into his jacket. We will take it, Jim said. We will make it official. The post office smelled like old paper and winter coats. People lined up at the counter with packages held like bread loaves. The clerk spoke with the patience of someone who had mastered small storms. Jim wrote an address that was not a street but a place a courier would understand. Slow block letters that made the world move at a speed you could trust. He paid for ink and movement. When the little printer cheered and pushed out the receipt, he set his palm on the stamp plate and pressed harder than necessary. He did not just accept the slip, he marked the moment with weight. The printed strip did not only confirm delivery, it planted a flag at this hour of this day that said a boy acted before a town panicked. Paper is quiet until it is asked to speak in rooms with shut doors. Out on Main Street, the air carried the dry perfume of sawdust and fresh-cut plywood. Tom Bradley stood in his doorway with sheets leaned like oars beside him, eyes narrowed at his windows, as if rehearsing the argument boards have with glass. Across the street, Mrs. Patterson fussed with a planter, then went inside, and the bell over her door made more noise than bells need. A television van coiled cables like snakes into its metal stomach, A reporter mouthed a sentence without voice, then checked her phone and lifted her eyes with brows a notch higher, as if the script had shifted under her shoes. A man in a plain leather vest, colors covered, held a door for an elderly couple, and the old man nodded, surprise cracking his frown into courtesy. Little edits were already being made to how the town held itself. A police cruiser slid by with lights turning and sirens sleeping, colors washing the storefronts in silent pulses. Behind the wheel, the chief held his jaw like a man calculating 3 problems with 1 piece of chalk. He looked at plywood leaning toward windows, at handwritten closed signs, taped too neat, and shook his head once. Small, and not for the camera. Tommy watched the car glide past, and understood without knowing the job words that the town's own hands were too small for what was arriving. This was larger than parade permits and traffic cones. This was the kind of puzzle that draws federal attention, because if you put enough bikes on a map, the lines start to look like corridors. Somewhere not far away, a woman with a badge and a careful voice would already be printing memos and sharpening the edges of plans. He did not know her name yet. He could feel where she would walk. They went home by the long way because his father needed the air. In the kitchen, the canteen sat where he had left it earlier, catching a late slice of sun and returning it without bragging. He turned it in his hands. The metal was cool where his fingers had not warmed it, and faintly rough where the forest had scraped its story into it. He thought of it waiting on the hospital nightstand among humming machines, the only object that looked stubborn and human. He thought of the little silver tab near a collar, threads softened by years of touch. He thought of the torn seam on a different vest, and the heavy black stitches that tried to make insult into armor. After dinner, the phone rang again. His father answered and spoke for a while to someone whose voice arrived without a number he could call back. He said the kind of yeses that mean "I hear you," and the kind of okay that means "I will do what I can from here." When he hung up, he and his wife traded the kind of look married people trade when the winds shift. Tommy saw something tip in his father's face, from maybe to soon. The evening made its round. Toothbrush and paste, a check of the back door, a glance at the sky in case snow had set its mind on the town. In bed, Tommy lay with his hands flat on the blanket and his eyes open to the dark until the room became a softer kind of blue. He pictured a field outside town, grass pressed flat by nothing yet. He pictured lines of bikes sliding into place like migrating geese, loud and orderly and less frightening when you learn the grammar of their noise. He pictured standing a little closer than expected to the person at the center of it all, not to shield him from harm the way he had under trees, but to shield him from the first story strangers might tell when they saw leather before they saw a face. He did not plan speeches. He planned where to put his feet. Sleep came the way heavy coats do. With weight and warmth, he dreamed in sound before he dreamed in pictures. Engines far away, a low, layered thunder that pressed against his chest without hurting it. Somewhere inside the dream, a gavel touched old wood and made a small, clean sound. Somewhere inside the waking world, a different set of wheels turned, marked by quiet lights that do not wail. And a woman he did not know yet flipped a page and wrote a name she would learn in the morning. Morning came in a dull pewter wash. The sky, the color of a spoon forgotten in dishwater. Tommy woke with the low engine hum from his dream still living in his rib, a steady thrum that did not scare so much as remind. Downstairs, the house made its small working sounds. The heat clicked and sighed. The refrigerator breathed a careful breath, and his mother set his silver rim mug by the sink without a word. He touched the thin band with one finger, the way you touch a coin for luck, then drank. The metal at his lip was cool and ordinary. Some things still held. The walk to school tasted of salt from road grit and the cold that rides close to the ground. At the corner, a cruiser idled with its lights asleep and its radio turned low, a voice murmuring numbers like a weather chant. The officer inside pretended to be part of the scenery and did not quite manage it. Outside the bakery, an A-frame sign announced limited hours in careful hand lettering, as if neatness could steady nerves. Across the street, old Mr. Dunn hammered a first board across his window. Each flat blow rode down Main and came back thinner, a sound like patience forced into wood. In class, Miss Santos took attendance with her usual quick pencil, but kept glancing at the glass as though the sky might answer a question. When she passed Tommy, she rested her hand on his shoulder for no longer than a breath. A small anchor dropped without splash. At recess, a second cruiser joined the first at the far end of the playground, the pair of cars making a quiet wall of blue and white. The officer in the new car balanced paperwork on his wheel and looked up between lines as if paragraphs might fly wrong if not watched. Lunchtime made a nest for whispers under the clatter. "Parents are picking up early," said one voice like it was a contest. "My mom says the bikers will take over the gas station," said another with the wide eyes of borrowed fear. Tommy chewed and listened to the shape of the talk. Fear stretched facts thin and draped them over whatever frame was handy. After school, the hallway held more coats and more questions than usual, and the smell of outside came in on sleeves. On the bulletin board, a notice with the city crest asked the town to meet at the high school gym that night. The font worked hard to look calm. They drove the long way because his father liked to look with his own eyes. Tom Bradley had finished one board and started another. The hardware store looked like it was blinking slow. Mrs. Patterson had written "closed for inventory" in a hand traced twice to steady it. A television van idled by the diner, while a man fed a cable into its metal belly, hand over hand. The reporter from yesterday stood beneath the awning and moved her mouth through a sentence without voice, then nodded to the camera. On the side of the van, a side monitor looped a still from the night before. Low red light, a bar top, polished by years of elbows, a leather vest thrown across it like a warning flag. At the shoulder seam, a tear had been cut and mended with coarse black thread, stitches raised and stubborn against the hide. It looked less like a repair than a scar proudly shown. In the corner of the frame, a small block of letters marked the time like a seal. Proof wore numbers on its face. At the post office, Jim took the receipt from yesterday and flattened it on the counter with his palm. The neat machine ink fixed a date and an hour in place like a nail in a beam. The clerk offered a clear sleeve, and he slid the strip inside. Before they left, he lifted the old flip phone from his jacket, popped the back, and set the tired battery beside the sleeved receipt in the glove box of the truck. He closed the compartment deliberately. He did not slam, he pressed. In a world about to fill with other people's evidence, their small compartment became a family locker. The phone that had died on the call and the stamp that had fixed the letter were now under their own seal. Evening brought them and half the town to the high school gym. The air inside smelled of floor polish, and old sweat and paper programs passed. Folding chairs sat in neat rows that forgot how much people fidget. The stage had been dragged out and pushed to the far wall. The town had built itself a mouth and did not yet know what words would come out of it. Chief Dalton stood near the steps with a clipboard and the face of a man counting his problems by tens. He wore his uniform like a suit too tight in the shoulders. His jaw worked when he was not speaking, as if banking sentences for later. Mayor Henderson arranged sheets on the lectern and held their edges like someone stopping paper from moving of its own accord. A third figure stood just off the center line. Not on stage and not exactly off it. A woman in a dark blazer with a folder pressed to her ribs. She watched without staring. She held still the way a nurse holds still in an ICU, when stillness is the strongest medicine. Her badge hung quiet on a lanyard that did not need to convince anyone. The room bent around her in the way rooms do around a person whose authority lives in posture rather than volume. Tommy did not know her name, but he felt the scale shift. The town had called for larger hands. They took seats halfway back. The gym filled to standing and then kept filling. People who knew each other well stood too close or too far, measuring where friendship met fear. The microphone thumped once and made a hollow heartbeat. The mayor thanked everyone with words like neighbor and safety and cooperation. She invited the chief, who spoke about detours and barricades and presence. "We will maintain order," he said, and the sentence tried its best to square its shoulders. From the fourth row, a voice called for schools to close. Another voice asked for the National Guard. The way a person dials a number, they hope still works. Hands rose into the air, as if answers could be caught. Voices braided and frayed. The mayor lifted both palms and bought half the quiet she wanted. Then the woman in the dark blazer stepped forward only enough to let the microphone remember its physics and draw her words to the speakers. "I am Agent Sarah Chen," she said, each syllable clean. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. We are not here to run your town. We are here to keep imagination from doing the work that evidence should do." The room made a soft noise, not quite a laugh and not quite a groan. She waited. "Waiting is a tool when you use it well. We are monitoring interstate movement," she said, with the same cool edges as a ledger. "We have no evidence that the group honoring the boy plans to target civilians. We do have indicators that a rival group has increased activity along approach corridors." She did not say the name everyone tasted. She did not have to. The gym seemed to lean forward on a single hinge. "We are coordinating with state police," she went on. "Our goal is to keep panic from becoming the reason anyone gets hurt. Panic makes hard things soft where they must stay hard." A man near the back shouted about bikers drinking and fighting and scaring children. Agent Chen did not look at the man. She looked straight at Chief Dalton. And the room followed her, gaze like iron filings follow a magnet. "Fear of an image is not evidence," she said. "Behavior is evidence." It landed less like a slogan and more like a challenge, a public correction of the way the town had been trying to manage with feeling instead of fact. If the riders behaved within the law would stand with them. The corollary hung there for anyone willing to read it. If the riders followed rules, then fear had to explain itself. Tommy felt the slow settling in his chest, the click of a dial turned down by a notch. He looked at his father, whose jaw had unclenched by a small degree, and at his mother, whose hands had stilled on the envelope in her lap. He thought of the receipt in its sleeve, and the dead battery placed beside it. Their glove box turned into a quiet locker. He thought of the looping still on the van outside, with the black raised stitches at the seam, and the little square of time in the corner. Stones were being laid in a shallow stream. If you placed your feet on the right ones, you could cross. Questions moved through their usual shapes and tired themselves out. The superintendent spoke about buses and bells, as if normal could be scaffolded around strange. A shop owner spoke about boards and insurance in a voice already worn. An elderly woman with trembling hands said she did not want to fear boys. She had waved to for years. The room softened for her, then hardened again when a younger man snapped that clubs were only gangs with better shirts. The word hung like a foul ball, looking for a hand to punish. Agent Chen did not raise her voice. "We do not comment on labels," she said. "We respond to act. Our cameras do not read patches. They read time, place, action." Tommy let the line roll in his head and thought about the small silver tab near the collar and the way his eyes had read what cameras could not. Some truths belong to people rather than systems. Not everything needed a lens to be real. As people stood and collected coats, Agent Chen stepped toward the chief. She opened her folder so only he could see. On the paper, a wide circle marked the planned gathering field, and pressing against one side, like a tide against a shore, a narrow crescent of marks showed the likely approach of trouble. As she spoke, she drew a fingertip along the crescent, then tapped the circle twice, then traced a slender line that ran between them. The meaning was clear without names. The ride would be a city with walls. The threat would try to curve around the wall. A third shape could meet it there. Not a blockade, not a charge, something in between. A mixed front. The chief stopped grinding his jaw for a count of 2 and nodded like a man who had been offered a plan he could live with. Outside, the lot lay silver under the lamps. A cruiser eased past with lights turning slow and no sound. Blue, then red, then blue again. An optical pulse that refused to scold. At the edge of the pavement, an unmarked sedan idled with its interior light off. A figure inside held a phone to their face, then lowered it and wrote. The car rolled away at a speed that suggested thought rather than hurry, as if a sentence had found its verb and could now be delivered. Back in the truck, Jim opened the glove box. He set the old flip phone itself beside the sleeved receipt and the loose battery, then closed the door with the same measured pressure. The box clicked shut like a latch on a small museum case. Their call and their stamp lived together now, a pair of quiet anchors that could later say what happened and when. Sarah watched the closed door for a heartbeat, then turned forward, her hands folded like she was keeping a cup from spilling. "Do you want to see Grandma tomorrow?" she asked, not to change the subject, but to give the mind another chair to sit in. "Yes," Tommy said, because the quilt on Grandma's couch would smell of cedar, and because she would tell a story about fear that did not get the last word. At home, the mug with the silver rim went back onto its shelf with a soft, ceramic click. Tommy set his canteen on the table where it seemed to belong now, the metal cylinder catching the last thin line of light and keeping it without glitter. He ran his palm over the steel, and it gave a little heat back. In his room, he stood a while at the window. The street outside held the kind of quiet that means the world is working in other rooms. Far out where the pines thicken around the county road, the air carried a faint note, not a siren, not a police wail, a single bright horn from a motorcycle, short and clean, caught and stretched by trees until it became a ribbon. The sound did not frighten. It had rhythm. It sounded like a promise spoken in a language his ribs had already learned. "We are coming," it said without words. "We are coming, and we know how to keep a line." He lay down with that line moving through him and felt the house settle and the town breathe and the night make room for morning whether or not anyone was ready. Dawn arrived in pale bands. Thin silver brushed over darker gray, as if the sky were being sanded toward daylight. Tommy woke before the alarm and lay still, listening to the house breathe. Heat ticked in the vents. The refrigerator gave a careful sigh. And from the kitchen, his mother set his silver rim mug by the sink with a soft ceramic click. Under those familiar notes, another sound gathered at the edge of hearing, low and layered, a distant tremor pressing into the air like a thumb into dough. Engines, many of them, finding the county road and rolling it like a drum. He dressed in the chill. A sweatshirt could not quite keep out, and went to the window. Beyond the roofs and pine, a moving line crested the hill. Headlights winked, then held steady in pairs. The sound did not crash. It advanced, a tide with its own patience, the rhythm of many hearts that had agreed on one beat. His father waited at the table with keys and wallet set square. and when they stepped into the cold, he glanced once at the canteen on the counter, once at Tommy, and gave a small nod, the kind of wordless promise men leave on doorframes as they pass. Frost jeweled the grass into 1,000 tiny mirrors. Down the slope of town, Main Street lifted its face to the procession. The first pairs turned left at the grain elevator, exactly where a hand on a map had traced the arc the day before. They rode in a measured file, inside lines keeping to inside, outside lines to outside, turn signals ticking in unison at the bend. It was not a swarm, it was a current. Every rider wore a helmet. Every speed matched the posted signs. Every stop sign got its count. The surprise was not that they came. The surprise was how they came. The wild rumor translated into choreography. Porch doors opened. People stepped into sweaters and coats, and the old habit of bracing then stood with their arms lowered as the formation went by. Mrs. Patterson stood in her doorway and did not fuss with the planter. Tears found her anyway, clean and unannounced. Across the street, Tom Bradley set his palm to the sheet of plywood on his window, felt the cool grain under his hand, and let it drop. He watched the quiet discipline roll past, and flushed with the slow heat of embarrassment. The body's way of owning a mistake. He had trusted his boards more than a boy's courage. The sight of order made that choice feel small. At the field outside town, the gate stood open, gravel tamped hard by a county truck. A cruiser idled near the entrance with lights turning and siren asleep. Chief Dalton leaned a gloved hand on the fender, jaw not grinding for once. The woman in the dark blazer stood a pace off with a radio hissing clipped phrases into her palm. She listened more than she spoke. When she did speak, numbers came out like tidy nails going into wood. 2 by 2, the first wave turned in and peeled off into chalked slots. Banners slid from saddlebags and rose on short lengths of rebar tapped into ground. Detroit, Milwaukee, Toledo, Indianapolis. The fabric did not shout. It announced. A drone lifted with a mosquito buzz, climbed into a slow ring, and settled into its circuit. An officer called the first wide frames hour into his mic, the words landing on the morning like a stamp you could not see but could feel. Tommy pressed his hands to the cold fence wire, breath frosting softly. A rider with a weathered face and a crow's-foot grin at one eye glanced over and lifted 2 fingers in a small salute. Here and gone. Another rider paused to settle a glove, and a little boy from town handed him a tissue through the mesh with the solemn care of an altar boy. The biker took it and nodded as if accepting a medal. Agent Chen walked the line toward the small command tent and paused with the chief. From her folder, she showed a grid only he could see. The circle of the field wore pins along its edge, where chapters had planted. On the crescent side, 2 small marks had been inked with a different pen. She did not say the name everyone tasted at the back of the tongue. She touched the marks and then looked to the trees, as if asking them to confirm what the paper implied. With a tap to her headset, she sent a second drone lower, angling it toward the timber so its camera would see under the first row of branches. She was not watching a parade. She was building a record. Tommy and his parents eased through the gate when the line of riders opened to let them. Razor came from the front ranks, helmet off, smile wide enough to pull at the healing under his cheekbone. He crouched as far as his ribs allowed and put his eyes level with the boys. "Morning, kid," he said. "You beat the sun. You brought your friends." Tommy said, "They heard about water." Razor answered, glancing back at the rows before he returned his gaze. They figured the least they could do was show up and behave. The way he said behave carried weight, not apology. It sounded less like manners and more like a plan. Order, offered as a gift. Strategy wrapped as respect. Thunder Jackson stepped up. hair swept back, a public face that had learned when to be soft. He shook Jim's hand firm without possession, then Sarah's with a fraction more care, reading the history in the grooves of old rings. Then he looked at Tommy, and did not perform at all. "We read your letter," he said. "Every one of us." Heat climbed Tommy's neck in a good way. He did not say that he had seen a vest on the screen with stitches like a scar, and that the sight of thread could talk. He kept that coin in his pocket for the moment it would buy more. The first rows finished settling. In the middle of the field, a folding table had been set with a mason jar, its glass catching the first true sun. A hand-lettered label said "For kids who need help," the script ugly and confident. A single bill slid in with a soft whisper, then another, then a stack. The bank manager, who had arrived to frown at liability, and found himself instead in need of usefulness, rolled up his sleeves and began to stack and square the bills in deliberate tower, counting aloud in a clear, steady tone. The nurse from pediatrics stood beside him in scrubs with a clipboard, her pen tracking the totals line by line. She called each count back, and the manager confirmed, 2 signatures arriving in real time through breath and ink. It was not just charity. It was a ledger being born in the open. The television crew set their tripod just beyond the fence. The reporter took her place where the light made her hair mean something. On their small monitor, the drone feed ran with a clean corner time and a smooth horizon. The camera kept a respectful distance and harvested images like careful fruit, not tearing, not grabbing. Chief Dalton cleared his throat and walked forward. "Gentlemen," he said, and his voice wore a careful neutrality like a clean shirt, "you will have your field and your route as agreed. We will have officers where they are needed." His gaze went to Thunder, then to Razor, then past them to the boy who had set the day in motion. His eyes did not show suspicion. They showed a trained readiness that was learning how to coexist with trust. Thunder nodded once. "We are here to honor the boy," he said. "We are here to be seen behaving." He did not add that being seen had become its own kind of shield. A quiet passed across the grass. Not the absence of sound, but the arrival of attention. Thunder lifted a hand, and the engines nearest him died. Then the ones beyond, the hush blooming outward in concentric petals until the field thrummed only with the residue of the morning's tide. He turned toward town. He did not give a speech. He raised 2 fingers, and the front rank rolled in a low idle toward Main. At the first intersection, every left hand flicked a signal, and the amber blinked like commas punctuating a long sentence under control. Where the speed limit dipped, they dipped. Where a crosswalk held a grandmother with a grocery sack, a bike stopped and waited with both feet down and both hands visible on the bar. Mrs. Patterson watched that and wept in a new way. Tears for the relief that follows a fear that has outlived its use. On the hardware store stoop, Tom Bradley lifted his palm from the plywood he had trusted more than his neighbor, and nodded at the riders the way a man nods when he knows he owes someone an apology and has not yet found the words. Back at the field, the jar filled faster than the manager's hands could count. He tore a deposit slip from his pocket pad and began a running ledger, while the nurse called out totals and wrote each figure again for a second signature. They were making a chain of custody under open sky. No mystery, no shadows. Ink answering to ink, while the town watched. Thunder stopped long enough to sign once at the bottom line, and when the doctor from pediatrics arrived, she countersigned. Hair, name under his, medicine and motor on the same page. Near the command tent, Agent Chen's radio hissed a tighter note. Movement in the line of trees to the east. Came the voice. 2, possibly 3. She did not look at the trees. She looked at Thunder, then at the chief, then at Razor. It was only a glance, a quick question without words. Had he known this? Had he expected the shadow to rim the circle? Razor held her gaze for the length of one breath and returned a truth in kind. Not surprise, not fear, a readiness that lived under bone. She tapped her headset. 2 short touches, and the second drone eased lower, on a careful arc toward the timber. The first drone held the wide, the second hunted the edge. Her hand never left the folder, but the picture was already changing inside it. Tommy felt the air thicken the way soup does when a cook turns the flame up one notch. He squared his shoulders without deciding to. He thought of the stitches on the screen from the night before, and the crescent on the map, and the signatures on the paper, and the jar that had become a ledger, and the hand on his back. Light and certain. Order had been offered and accepted. The first promise of the day had been kept with discipline and grace. The next promise would cost more to keep. When the front rank curved back from Maine and idled into the field again, boots touched ground in near unison, and visors stayed down. The silence that followed was not empty. It had structure. It said, "We can be loud, and we can be quiet, and both can have rules." Standing within that order, Tommy looked once toward the trees, where the line went dark, and felt the wire of the day draw tight. The morning had stacked its evidence like stones across a stream. The far bank waited with its own intention. By late morning, the field sounded like careful work. Engines idled only where they must. Voices lowered near the counting lane, as if respect itself had a volume knob. The jar had proven too small, and now 2 lock-top boxes sat on the folding table, their clear walls rising like small aquariums full of paper fish. The bank manager rolled his sleeves and counted in a steady cadence, each number spoken clean and slow for anyone within earshot to follow. Beside him, the pediatric nurse answered each total aloud, repeating the figure with deliberate clarity, and then named the signer before she set her pen down. "Thunder Jackson," she said, and she drew the line. Then she lifted the clipboard so the crowd could see the signature. It was not simply bookkeeping. It was performance against rumor, a deliberate choreography of proof in daylight. Tommy stood just inside the fence, the wire cool under his fingers, the smell of cut grass and warmed chrome mixing in the air. He watched money become math, and math become record. The bank manager slid a rubber band around a squared stack with a soft twang and tucked it into a tamper bag. He wrote the hour in words, and his initials in dark blue, and the nurse laid her name under his in the same neat hand she used on medication charts. The little portable printer chirped like a bird each time a receipt clipped free, and the bank stamp fell once, the ink thunk as satisfying as a tiny gavel. Every gesture said, "We know you are watching." And that is the point. News drifted from the television van like a draft from a door someone kept opening. The lower banner tried a question it clearly preferred as an answer: tribute or takeover. It asked with a smile in its voice you could not hear and still felt. Behind the reporter, the same barroom still appeared again. Leather shoulder, black stitches like a scar sewn to show. Now a gray chat bubble slid across the screen with a smirk of text, claiming the jar was a cover and that no receipts existed in the wild. The rumor tried to take shape in the air like breath in cold. Tom Bradley, who had come to the fence holding his cap in 2 hands the way a man holds a hymn book, looked from the van to the table and back. He saw slips piling like white shingles. He heard the nurse call totals loud enough to reach him, and the banker answer back, voice precise and boring by design. He looked down at his palm, rough with sawdust, then up at the riders moving in neat lines and at the boy by the fence, and he flushed with the honest heat of being wrong. He pressed his cap to his chest and let the feeling sit until it taught him something. Razor came to stand beside Tommy without fanfare, not in front and not behind, just there. When a young man in a thin hoodie slid along the fence line with his phone face down and his voice pitched for poison, Tommy did not turn. Heard the kid made it up for clout, the murmur said. Heard the chain was fake. Heard his mom works at the school and this is a stunt. The words were seeds flicked at a wall, hoping one might find a crack. Razor placed his hand on the top rail above Tommy's shoulder, not to shield, and not to claim, but to share the weight of restraint. They both kept their eyes on the table where reality wrote itself in ink. They chose the ledger over the whisper, and in choosing it together, they made a shape stronger than reply. Agent Chen stood at the volunteer tent with her folder tucked under one arm, the plastic corner warmed by her sleeve. An aide moved to her side with a small tablet and a close whisper. The agent glanced not at the screen but at the counting table, and then at the small crowd gathered in a loose horseshoe around it. She touched her headset with a fingertip. Body cameras live, she said into the lower channel, and across the field officers at choke points pressed the dark squares on their vests in unison. She added drone 2 lower and east. Hold the wide until I say. The second drone tipped its lens and drifted toward the tree line with a polite buzz. The first drone kept the cathedral shot of order laid like calligraphy across winter grass. Through the lens, a quick silver caught on bark. Not a deer and not a soda can. A glint, like the flat side of a small wrench or the smooth mouth of a lock bar. The aide angled the tablet, but Agent Chen read the scene the way a ranger reads weather, with skin and habit. She cut a glance to Razor that asked a tight question without sourness. You knew a shadow would rim the circle. He met the look with one of his own. Not a denial, not an invitation. Readiness, that old word stitched near his collar, living under his stillness. At the edge of the field, 2 riders in plain jackets eased their bikes along the fence, as if stretching after a long sit. No colors, no back patches, no eagerness. They looked like local men who had wandered into a parade and decided to be useful. Tommy saw the way their eyes mapped the row of trunks and the gap where the brush thinned. Scouts, he thought, though he did not know the word as a job. The ride had its own quiet watchers, and their watching folded into the day like a seam hidden in good cloth. The donations kept climbing. The bank manager halted to wet his thumb and smiled at his own old habit, then apologized to the nurse for the pause with a little bow that made a knot of laughter ease through the crowd. The nurse read the number back and then raised the clipboard so the camera on the officer's chest could see the line and the name under it. She was not simply recording, she was performing a defense the way a choir performs a creed. The rumor boy drifted off, bored by the way. Proof made poor kindling. On Main, the procession paused at a crosswalk, and a grandmother with a grocery sack walked across with a new kind of dignity. Her steps, finding a rhythm, with the quiet thrum of idling pistons. Mrs. Patterson wiped her cheeks with the heel of her hand and left a clean track on her skin and kept watching. Apron still tied as if gratitude might call her back to the kitchen. Near the gate, Chief Dalton approached Thunder, without squaring his shoulders like a challenge. He looked like a man who had slept less and seen more. You will have an escort to the hospital when the boxes are sealed, he said. And then, as if admitting something to himself, I understand now that public can be a kind of protection. He did not look at the camera when he said it. He looked at the nurse holding the pen and at the bank stamp resting like a small blue moon in its cradle. A clear note from a motorcycle horn threaded from the trees and cut itself short. Razor's posture did not change. His palm stayed on the rail. The plain jacket riders made a gentle arc and settled their bikes near the eastern edge. neither near nor far, just present. In the lot, an unmarked sedan settled behind a cruiser, brake lights easing off in a long exhale. The television reporter tried once more near the fence. The banker lifted the top page and said the totals will be posted with signatures at day end, and the nurse added that any citizen could request a copy at the hospital office. She spoke loud enough that the claim of no receipts sounded foolish even in the mouth that made it. The camera found nothing hot to eat and moved back to capture the wide. Then the count reached a round figure that made the nurse catch her breath and grin. A cheer unspooled from the crowd, not the roaring kind, but the warm draft a bakery door makes. When someone comes in with good news, Thunder stepped to the table only far enough to sign the line. Dr. Williams arrived in her winter coat and read the page and signed beneath his name. The bank manager lifted 2 tamper tags and fed them through the plastic hasps. They clicked shut crisp as a lock on a safe. He read each tag number aloud and wrote it on the ledger. The nurse took a yellow highlighter from her pocket and drew a bright line under each tag number until the paper glowed. The act was small and ceremonial. It gave the numbers a little halo you could not argue with later. "This box says what it is," she said, and set her palm on the lid for a heartbeat. Agent Chen watched that palm touch and nodded once to no one, a tiny agreement with the day's method. Her aide lifted the tablet again. In the trees, the glint had moved and then stilled, like a fish deciding the current was wrong. The agent kept her voice level. "Maintain track," she said. "We wait for behavior, not shadows." The sentence sounded like law and mercy. Sharing a pocket, Tommy exhaled, and only then noticed he had been holding that breath since the graphic on the van tried to teach the day its shape. His mother's hand found his back and rested there, light as a folded letter and just as present. His father stood a half step behind, with his jaw unclenched, and a look that was mostly gratitude and a little apology. The right mixture for a good man learning something late. On the table, the banker slid the first sealed box into a clear sleeve and wrote the time in words across the top. Then the second, and the nurse underlined both entries until the paper wore bright tracks. The portable printer chirped once more, and the stamp thunked down with its small percussion. One last punctuation for the page. The doctor took the sleeve and tucked it under her coat, as if tucking a child in against weather. Behind the fence line, the wind carried the resin of pines and the faint metallic echo of something small touching something hard in the woods. The drones hummed in their circles like patient bees. The officers' cameras watched without blinking. The riders in plain jackets watched without showing. The ledger shone with highlighted lines like rails. Nothing here asked to be believed. It asked to be seen, and to be signed, and to be carried forward intact when the day changed its tone. By early afternoon, the light shifted from tin to pewter, a dull shine that made edges honest and faces plain. The field kept its careful rhythm. The lock-top boxes sat sealed and sleeved, each tamper tag number underlined in a bright band on the ledger the nurse held under her coat. The bank manager flexed his fingers as if shaking flour off them. The drones hummed like patient bees. The air smelled of cut grass, cooled exhaust, and the faint sweetness of church cookies. Tommy stood where the fence met the gate, palms on the wire, eyes tracing the slow geometry of order. He felt the field breathe in one long body, a tide that had learned a steady stroke. Razor drifted from a knot of leaders and returned to stand beside him, close enough that the heat from his jacket rounded the cold from the boy's shoulder. A rider jogged in from the parking edge with something pinched lightly between 2 fingers. Cardboard, not a sign, a snarl. Thunder took the scrap without a flinch and held it steady so the wind could not steal it. He did not read the scroll. He let Agent Chen arrive with a gloved hand already open. "Let me," she said, voice even. Thunder passed the note across as if handing a tool to a worker who knew exactly where it belonged. She slid the cardboard into a clear sleeve. The plastic whispered. With her free hand she uncapped a marker and wrote place and hour in clean block letters along the top margin. A nearby officer angled his chest so the small lens could see the act. "Chain begins here," she said, not a flourish, a line item. The officer repeated it for his audio, voice flat as law. Chief Dalton brought a small field kit and held it out like a habit he trusted. Chen snapped a seal over the mouth of the sleeve until it clicked, the sound of a latch finding home. She raised the bag so the camera could read the scrawl without giving it a stage. "I will paraphrase," she said, and her mouth bent in a dry half-smile. "The writer promises an ending. The writer names serpents. The writer tries to make fear feel tall." Then she pressed her thumb to the seal and let her hand fall. Tommy's eyes found the letters through the plastic. "Your little hero party ends today. Serpents do not forget. Serpents do not forgive." The words wanted to pull the day into their orbit. The sleeve refused. Process made the tone small. Razor breathed once, slow and whole. He did not posture. He reached toward the fence rail above Tommy's shoulder and rested his palm there. Knuckles, pale and calm. "You doing all right, kid?" he asked, voice pitched for just them and the wire. He looked into the boy's eyes, not only to be kind, he was checking for fear, like a diver, checking a gauge before the next descent. A little girl with braids threaded a hand through the fence and offered a cookie from the church jar. Her face solemn as a deacon's. Razor took it, broke it clean, and handed half to Tommy without looking away from the trees. "Thanks, kid," he said to both of them. Tommy bit. Cinnamon touched his tongue first, warm and familiar, and under it came another taste, thin as a coin, the iron edge of waiting. He chewed and knew the air had changed key. Near the table, Dr. Williams and the bank manager stood shoulder to shoulder like two ends of a bridge. She called out totals with clear emphasis, named Thunder's signature, and held the page so every watching eye and every recording lens could see the line. It was a deliberate chorus against rumor, proof sung on purpose. At the volunteer tent, Agent Chen angled her face toward her aide's tablet, just long enough to register the shape of the drone's feed. A quick glint lived in the trees. Not deer bright, not trash bright, the slick wink of smooth metal where bark should show. She did not widen her eyes. She tapped her headset. "Hold track," she said. "We wait on behavior." Her glance cut to Razor. A question threaded into it. "You expected a rim of shadow." He answered with a tiny nod that did not travel to his shoulders. "Ready, not eager." Two riders in plain jackets eased their bikes along the fence like farmhands checking a ditch. No colors, no back patches. One bent to tie and untie a lace that had never needed tying. The other leaned a forearm on the wire and squinted into brush like he had dropped a socket there last week. They did not hunt theater. They watched for proof. Beside Tommy, Razor kept his hand on the rail. "If we move," he said, low and steady, "you go behind the counting table. You keep one hand on the nurse's sleeve unless she tells you otherwise." "Deal." The word sleeve landed with weight. The sleeve held the ledger, the tag numbers, the signatures. The chain of custody had a fabric skin, and Tommy's small hand had just been quietly tied to it. "Deal," Tommy said, and the word felt like a job he could keep. Agent Chen stepped to the edge of the aisle and spoke so the chest cameras would drink every syllable. "You will hear the difference between first and second sounds. she said. You will watch restraint until it cannot hold. We will act on behavior, not on fear. The sentence sat in the air like a steel thread. Tommy looked from her to Razor. He understood a piece that belonged to him. Hearing was not enough. He would have to remember the order. He would have to know what happened first. If Razor moved, it would be after a sound that told the truth. The television reporter floated toward the fence with a microphone held like a spear and tried a hotter word, gang. Thunder faced her and then past her, his gaze taking in porches and children and the banner at town hall that had held through the morning wind. Clubs look like gangs to people who do not know the difference, he said. Kindness looks like weakness to people who do not practice it. He gave the field back its quiet without waiting for a retort. A rumor boy in a thin hoodie slid by with his phone belly up and his voice pitched for rot. Heard the chain was staged. Heard the boy wanted fame. Heard the biker was not hurt. The words skittered along the fence like seeds flicked at a wall. Tommy did not turn. Razor's palm stayed where it was, sharing steadiness. At the counting lane, the nurse lifted the page again, underlines bright as sunlight, and named the signer in a voice built for clarity. The stamp thunked once, small and final. Chief Dalton stood with his palm resting on the cruiser's fender, watching the wind, not the storm. Boys, he said to two deputies without looking away from the trees, walk to the road cut. If you see something, be exact. If you do not invent it. The deputies went like men on a fence check. Boots quiet. Thunder set a small leather roll on the table beside the sealed boxes, the kind of kit carpenters carry. He did not open it. He let it sit there like a square laid on a bench before a precise cut. He looked at the doctor, at the banker, at the boy. Work faces. All of them. Steele returned from the fence with the plain jacket riders in a wider arc. Movement in the scrub, he said, voice low. Not secret, not local. Boots too clean. They think trees make them invisible. They forget we grew up here. Agent Chen's mouth made a quick smile that respected competence and then flattened again. State unit. Hold at the shoulder, she said into the radio. County. Staggered two cars at the gravel entrance. Our friends inside the fence will manage the soft edge. Tommy's mother moved closer, the weight of her palm finding the middle of his back. His father took one step to stand between the gate and the boy, without blocking any sightline. The field seemed to tilt a degree, just enough to teach balance. From the east, a small sound snapped, a twig yielding too cleanly to be wind, and too deliberately to be a deer. Every chest in the field seemed to take the same quiet breath. The drones held their circles. The officers' cameras watched without blinking. The nurse's sleeve warmed under the coat, the ledger a living thing against her ribs. In the trees, someone laughed the wrong kind of laugh, high and thin, a sound designed to cut rather than share. At that same instant, Razor's fingers tightened on the fence rail, a slight squeeze at a spot that had been quietly agreed upon. Not for panic, for signal. The metal under Tommy's hands hummed the message into his bones. Agent Chen's hand hovered over her radio like a ringer over a bell that must not be struck a heartbeat early. Not yet, she had said before. Now the field listened for the first true sound that would turn not yet into now. Tommy felt the cinnamon taste fade and the iron taste rise. A tide he could not stop, only ride. He put his free hand where it belonged, on the nurse's sleeve in his mind, ready to move. When Razor said move, ready to remember which sound came first, ready to be the boy on the wire who held the chain tight when the world yanked. We behave, Thunder had promised. For the boy, the promise stood in the cold with its shoulders squared. The day drew tight around it like a belt before a lift. The next second sharpened into a blade. The wrong laugh sliced the tree line thin as wire, and the fence hummed under Tommy's hands when Razor's fingers tightened a small squeeze at the agreed spot. The drone kept its courteous circle. The air changed its mind. The first sound arrived like a board snapped 2 rooms away. A single hard crack with a flat tail. Not wind, not twig, not accident. Tommy felt it land in his ribs the way a slammed locker lingers. His eyes went to Agent Chen's mouth. "Evacuate civilians," she said, and the word evacuated silence too. Not panic, not scatter, but movement that knew its job. Thunder lifted one arm and pointed, and the line of leather did what it had promised to do. Men in plain jackets flowed to the fence. Men in colors made a wall that breathed. Boots scuffed, not scrambled. Hands found children, as if that were what hands had been invented for. Behind the counting table, Dr. Williams looked up, already moving. The ledger pulled tight beneath her coat like a warm heart. Razor's hand left the rail and pressed the small of Tommy's back. A gentle push that was not a question. Behind the table, "Kid," he said, even and close. One hand on the nurse's sleeve. Now, Tommy moved. The world narrowed to useful pieces. The silver wink of the nurse's pen, the bright bands underlining the tag numbers, the blue square jaw of the bank stamp in its cradle. His palm found the warm wool of the nurse's sleeve and stayed. The second sound came fast on the first, closer and meaner, a rattling pop that liked its own voice. An officer's body camera caught the first muzzle echo from the eastern trees, and the drone above caught the same flash from a different angle. A heartbeat later, on Agent Chen's aide's tablet, tidy white numbers stamped themselves in the corner, clean as truth on a form. "Shots fired east tree line," an officer said, steady as a metronome. Civilians behind the table. Thunder called, and bodies learned again how to be shelter. A small child slipped and 2 hands found her at once, one tattooed, one with a wedding band. Both certain. Bark spat from a pine at the edge, and a bike mirror went with a small bright tinkle. A rider in a plain jacket sank to one knee and pulled an older woman in a church coat behind the block of a parked engine, turning his own back toward the trees without flourish. Nearby, a Milwaukee patch took a splinter on the sleeve and did not move his face. Agent Chen did not raise her voice. She stepped 3 paces toward the table, radio near her mouth, eyes on people. "County, tighten the gravel entrance," she said. "State, hold the shoulder. Body cameras live. Drones recording. We act on behavior." Her thumb touched the transmit twice. Not for drama, for the log. Razor had not moved toward the noise. He moved to the boy and then to the edge, like a man who knows exactly where his feet belong when the floor shifts. The small silver tab near his collar lay quiet and said nothing aloud and meant everything it needed to mean. Another crack stitched shadows across the grass. Razor tipped his head halfway, meeting Tommy's eyes so the boy could read steadiness there. "You stay with her," he said, and he let the word "her" carry the ledger and the yellow lines and the blue stamp and the sleeve. The whole chain under one simple sound. Tommy nodded, and the nurse nodded back and pulled the ledger closer to her ribs. A deputy lifted 2 fingers low and pointed with his chin. Steele answered with one short nod. 2 plain jacket riders rose like men standing after a long sit and slid their angle, not toward, but along, letting trunks turn to shields. The drone dropped a courteous yard. On the aide's tablet, a smear of dark cloth showed where bark should have been, and the aide spoke the time in careful words, meant for a future sworn room. Chief Dalton laid a palm on the cruiser fender and watched wind in the crowns. He did not yank anything from his belt. "Walk," he told two officers in a voice you could level a shelf with. If you see hands, say hands. If you see a gun, say gun. If you see nothing, say nothing. Then the bark that was not echo cracked from inside the trees, and a ragged answer came from far right, outside the drone's first circle. From the dark, someone tried that wrong laugh again, a hook tossed across a crowd to snag nerves. It found none that had not been tied down. The iron under the cinnamon crept onto Tommy's tongue, thin as a coin. He could have counted his heart, and chose instead to count breaths, his and the nurse's, and the remembered rhythm of razors, when he had stood close enough to feel air move. Behind him, his mother drew in a measured sip, and his father let out a slow, even rope of air. Both by choice, the nurse lifted her coat edge and slid the ledger deeper, then glanced at the bank manager. He had not left. He lifted the stamp from its cradle and tucked it into his jacket like a small blue moon he had been told to guard. He opened a fresh tamper sleeve with a neat rip and held it ready like a clean envelope waiting on news. On the tablet, the drone steadied into a perfect angle. The nearer figure in the brush raised metal and fired toward the field, bright mouth blooming at the barrel. At that instant, a body camera on the gravel took the same flash from the side. 2 feeds, 2 angles, 1 first sound. Agent Chen leaned in, eyes flicking to the screens, and said, "Mark." For the span of a blink, her mouth made the smallest curve a person can make and still call it a smile. "Got them," the curve said and vanished, replaced by work. The aide spoke the time in full word. Agent Chen pointed to the tablet. "Origin," she said, "for the record and for the room." A plain jacket rider near the brush settled into a stance that belonged to other training, and shouted a word the trees swallowed. The figure jerked and fired again. Wild. A biker, 3 yards from Thunder, dropped to a knee and rose with a kid tucked beneath one arm, both of them breathing like swimmers choosing the nose. "Enough," Chief Dalton said, and his voice fell like a plumb line. 2 deputies who had waited for that wait stepped in. "Hands," they said. "Now." The second shadow tried to melt and met a fence post, where he had written empty air into his plan. He stumbled and made a sound that began as a laugh and broke into dirt. "Move the boxes," Agent Chen said, and Dr. Williams touched the bank manager's sleeve. The nurse shifted and Tommy's hand went with her sleeve because it had been told to. They carried the sealed lock-top boxes to the ambulance bay at the field edge. 2 officers flanking, chest cameras tilted to watch lids and fingers and tags. The bank manager read the tag numbers in clear words, and the nurse repeated them and circled each on the ledger with quick, bright strokes until the ink looked like halos. The stamp thunked a transfer line, and Dr. Williams signed and wrote Ambulance Bay Safe beneath her name. The words felt like a door closing in the right house. Outside, orders layered like careful bricks. Hands behind your head. On your knees, do not reach. Zip ties whispered. Breathing heaved, and then steadied the way breathing does when a person realizes the story has decided to move without him. By the command tent, Agent Chen took a small black drive with a red cap from the kit and set it in her palm. "Light and certain as a pebble. Backup drone 1 and 2, she said. The aide's fingers moved. The little printer chirped like a bird in spring. The agent slid the drive into a clear sleeve and wrote "Drone Merge" and the full time across the label in clean dark letters, then pressed a seal until it clicked. She set it on the table beside the blue stamp. Razor touched 2 fingers to the sleeve, not as tribute, not as superstition, but as acceptance of the only rules that mattered today. She met his eye and gave one precise nod. The law had seen what it needed to see, and it had kept the order of sounds. Thunder set 2 fingers on the sealed sleeve for the space of a breath, and Dr. Williams leaned in and countersigned the log the aide held out. The object had a name now, and a body and a path. It would outlast anyone's version. Tommy kept his palm on the nurse's sleeve until she slid the ledger into the ambulance bay safe. The heavy door gasped a small breath and latched with a good house sound. She turned the key they had agreed on and slipped it into a small envelope and wrote the time in words across its face, then placed the envelope in the bank manager's hand and laid her own hand over his for 1 second. He nodded, as if accepting a sacrament. On the gravel, 2 figures knelt, wrists cinched in clean plastic, faces turned toward a long future of stone walls and paperwork. A deputy read rights in a voice that scanned even. The second drone hovered and watched light catch on bands and on metal, now put far from any hand. Chief Dalton walked to the fence and looked through it like a window he had washed himself. He lifted his chin at Agent Chen. She raised the sealed sleeve a fraction. He nodded, and the tightness that had worked his jaw for days loosened into something else. Tommy saw the first true smile on the chief's face since the story began. Small and honest and hard-earned. Thunder turned once. Not a parade, not a claim, a count of faces and breath. He raised his hand, and the riders who could see him raised 2 fingers in answer, a quiet signal that meant, "We are good and will stay that way." He did not shout. He looked toward the boy at the table. Again Chen stepped near Tommy, not bending, just close enough for her voice to belong to him. "You did your job," she said. "When people ask what happened, you will tell them which sound came first." Tommy looked at Razor, then at the cuffs on the gravel, then back at the sealed sleeve on the table. He understood that the order of sounds was the difference between attack and defense, between story and proof, between accusation and the life of the man who had put his hand on a fence so the boy could borrow steadiness. Razor crouched as much as ribs allowed and set his palm on the table near the blue stamp and the sealed drive. "You all right, kid?" he asked. Tommy nodded, a yes that needed no larger word. Razor's gaze moved to the ambulance bay safe, to the closed door, to the nurse's underlines, and settled there. He breathed, and did not pretend it was easy. The reporter stood with dirt on both knees and lowered her microphone, as if it had grown too heavy to hold it. News would come, but not theater. It would look like receipts and seals and still frames from 2 angles. It would carry 1 small sentence about first and second sounds. The field exhaled into careful work again. A child laughed the right way, a small bell in clear air. The bank manager returned the stamp to its cradle. The nurse smoothed her sleeve, where a small hand had wrinkled it and left a warm memory no camera could catch. Chief Dalton's palm found the cruiser fender one more time and rested there, like thanks. Tommy looked up at the drone as it made a last wider circle before drifting higher. The little dark shape hung over pewter sky and then slid toward its roost. The corner time on the aide's tablet ticked forward in tidy words. The day had written itself into proof. It would hold. The briefing room breathed coffee and warm paper. A low hum from the projector like a steady lung. Tommy sat between his parents in the front row, knees together, palms flat on his jeans. On the cart beside the screen lay the safe key envelope with the nurse's careful time written in ink, the handwriting he could recognize now by the way each letter stood straight like a guard. It felt like a railing for his thoughts. Agent Chen stood at the cart with 2 clear sleeves in place. In one, the cardboard note crouched behind plastic. In the other, a small black drive with a red cap waited like a quiet witness. She tapped her pen against the metal edge, a click as neat as a latch. Chief Dalton leaned on the back wall, arms folded, jaw relaxed for the first time in what felt like a long week. "All right," she said, voice even. "We will run it through once. Then questions." Her eyes found Tommy for a heartbeat, not warning him, promising him that it would be clean. The screen dropped with a soft flap. The rectangle bloomed in cool light. Sky and the dark arc of a spinning prop settled into frame. White corner text sat firm as a stamped seal. The aide lowered the lights until the room turned the color of quiet water. "Drone 2, Chen said. The view dipped, tilted, steadying into bark and shade. A second rectangle appeared at the lower edge, the body camera's angle taking in gravel and fence. 2 eyes, 1 truth. The first crack landed in the speakers the way it had landed in Tommy's ribs, sharp and flat. In the drone view, the flash lived inside the trees. In the body camera view, the echo bounced along the gravel. "Mark," the Chen inside the clip said, and the corner text changed with the certainty of a clock that cannot be argued with. Tommy's fingers twitched and settled. He held the sentence she had given him like chalk writing on the board of his mind. Which sound came first? On the screen, the men moved exactly as they had moved. Plain jackets slid to the fence. Colors built a wall. A small shoe flashed, and 3 hands guided it behind chrome and leather. The body camera saw the bank manager tuck the blue stamp into his jacket. The drone saw the crown of his head bent to work. The second report rattled closer. Bark leaped from a trunk in a pale spray. The body camera jolted as its wearer dropped to a knee. The drone held like a practiced witness. "Hold track," the past voice said. Corner numbers marched on. The wrong laugh slipped through the speakers and made a few backs stiffen. Tommy watched his own small hand appear in the edge of the body camera's frame, sliding behind the table. Palm finding the nurse's sleeve, he felt again the warmth under wool, the pull of the ledger against her ribs, like a living weight. Shapes inside brush, sharpened into mistakes. A forearm rose at the wrong angle. A small mouth of light opened at the end of metal. The drone froze that bloom. The body camera caught its side. "Mark," past Chen said again. The room breathed once. Plain jackets stepped. Deputies echoed. A body turned and scooped a child under an arm. Thunder's voice moved low across the speakers. "Down." The reporter's microphone nose dipped into the picture and scraped out again. Then Chief Dalton's voice arrived, with the weight of a tool you trust. "Enough." Zip ties whispered. Hands went where hands must go. The drone hovered above plastic bands that caught light. The body camera watched knees meet gravel. The feeds shrank. A new rectangle opened on the counting lane. The nurse's pen underlined tag numbers in bright strokes. The bank stamp thunked a transfer line. Dr. Williams signed and wrote the safe destination in a firm hand. The projector went dark. The fan kept its even breath. The room held a single quiet beat. "Questions," Agent Chen said. Mrs. Patterson raised a careful hand. "Did any of our people fire first?" she asked. Voice soft and square. "No," Chen said. "You heard the first sound. You saw origin. Our side held until behavior required movement. Then they moved to protect. The cameras confirm. The timestamps confirm." Her tone placed each piece on a shelf, where it would not fall. A long exhale moved along the back wall. The bank manager lifted his folder. "Would you like the tags read on the record?" he asked. "Please," Chen said. He tapped each line with a blunt fingertip, reading the numbers clearly, noting the underlines the nurse had made, and the moments they were made, noting signatures present. When he finished, he closed the folder with a clean press of his palm. "Chain holds," Chen said, the pen in her fingers, making one last click. against the cart. A thin boy in a hooded sweatshirt raised his hand like it weighed more than he thought. "What if someone says the footage is made to look like that?" he asked. "Like sync." Chen did not sigh. "The drone clock is encoded in the feed," she said. "The body camera clock is internal. We merged them to a recorded time tone. You can hear it." She nodded to the aide. The aide scrolled back a breath. A crisp, digital chirp lived inside both frames at the same instant. Two clocks. One tone. Independent encoding. Bring your own expert. The math will live. The reporter on the side wall lifted her pad, then lowered it a little. "Kid," she said, "what did you hear first?" Tommy stood because standing made the question smaller. His shadow fell across the lower corner of the screen. "A crack," he said, "from the trees." Then the closer ones. He looked from Agent Chen to Razor to the sealed drive. He did not move at the first sound. He moved after. "That is it," the reporter said. "That is it," Tommy answered, and the knot inside him tied itself neatly. Thunder tipped his chin at Chen. "What becomes of the men in ties?" he asked. "Charges," she said. "Assault with a deadly weapon. Attempted homicide. Possible interstate additions. The trial will not be here. The paper will go where it is long." Chief Dalton pushed from the wall. "And us?" he asked the room. "What do we do today?" Dr. Williams set the key envelope back on the cart with a soft tap. "We deliver the boxes to the hospital foundation office," she said. "We log against the stamps. We order equipment. We make children breathe easier before winter turns hard." Nurse Patricia stood with her hand where the ledger had rested. "And we keep the ledger where it belongs," she said. "Copies available during office hours." The hooded boy cleared his throat. "I said stupid things earlier," he said, eyes on his shoe. "I saw the counting and thought it was a show." He looked at Tommy. "I was wrong." Tommy did the easiest right thing. "Thank you," he said, and the words felt like passing cold water to someone who needed it. Agent Chen lifted the threat note sleeve and set it beside the sealed drive. "These go together," she said, and then, with the economy of a soldier finished loading tools, she slid her pen into her lapel like a final magazine set. The gesture said the same thing. Her voice had said all along. "The record is built. Paper has won." Razor crossed the aisle and took the corner seat, careful with his ribs. He set his palm on the table near the bank stamp and the sealed drive and left it there. "You kept the order," he said to Tommy, and his fingers brushed the blue stamp, then lifted, then found the boy's eyes. The touch said what the words could not carry alone. "You guarded the numbers as surely as you guarded a man." Thunder spoke to Dalton about moving people in pairs. "No theater, no noise." Dalton agreed. "No sirens, no speed." Chairs scraped soft. Papers sighed. The aide tugged the cart away, its wheels chattering down the hall. In the doorway, the reporter stepped aside and did not ask for one more line. In the corridor, the bulletin board held the town banner safe from wind. The holes looked small now, tidy as moth bites. "Cedar Falls stands with Tommy and our visitors." The letters said, steady as a promise. Tommy read them once more and felt the cloth settle something inside him. By the doors, Nurse Patricia caught his sleeve for a second and set the bank stamp in his palm. "Feel that," she said. "That is what today sounds like." She blinked once, a private wink from one worker to another, and lifted the stamp away again, returning it to the careful pocket where it belonged. On the steps, a rider in Detroit colors passed by at a respectful pace. He tipped his chin to Tommy and, with a light touch, tapped the hooded boy's shoulder. A small, wordless truce, signed in passing. The boy nodded, shy and relieved, and looked a little taller. Chief Dalton held the door. Cold air met them honest and clean. Tommy saw a real smile touch the chief's face. small and unworried, the first he could remember since the woods. It made the day feel finished in the right way. Across the street, the ambulance bay door rolled down with a rubber squeal and a metal sigh. Behind it, the safe sat with its good weight, the ledger cooling in the dark like bread that would be cut for others. Tommy liked the picture and kept it. His mother slid her hand into it. His father tapped the back of his head with the flat of his palm, the mark he used when a day deserved to be noticed. Razor fell in a half-step behind them, close without crowding, the shape of him like a shadow that had chosen company. Tommy glanced up. The drone was a fleck-headed home. Without thinking, his fingers brushed his chest where the visitor badge had stuck earlier, and then his eyes found the small silver tab at Razor's collar. The Canteen's memory tipped cold and clean across his mind. The tab's silence answered. 2 private promises, one made and one kept. He breathed. He did not count. The town sounded different now, hammers thudding in a friendly rhythm as boards came off windows, a motorcycle ticking as it cooled, a child's laugh rolling away light as a bright marble. When people ask, he thought, I will tell them the first sound, then I will tell them what we did next. And he walked on, carrying the quiet weight of a day that had signed itself in ink and settled at last. Snow fell soft as sifted flour over Cedar Falls, a quiet white that gentled edges and slowed breath. It powdered the banner in its glass case inside the town hall, the letters steady behind reflection, the bullet kisses now only small dark rings in cloth. Tommy stood with his mittened hand on the cold pane and read the line again, the way he always did before pushing the brass door. The hall smelled of lemon polish and old wood, a clean scent that felt like rules kept and tools put away. Opposite the banner, the quilt glowed like a small sun. Leather squares, denim, school blue, hospital green, a corner of apron cotton, a sliver of police sleeve, all stitched into a bright circle around the center patch cut from an honorary jacket. Thread traced paths that crossed and recrossed, and here and there, a loop of embroidery underlined tag numbers, as if the seamstress had wanted even cloth to testify. Tommy let his gaze follow a single thread from the center outward and back again, until his breath fogged the glass that covered the quilt face. They did not talk much in that room. Talking seemed like putting fingerprints on a page already signed. His mother shook out her scarf and stamped once, boots, thudding a soft drum on the floorboards. His father rubbed his hands together, making a low rasp like kindling. Razor stood in the doorway and shed the cold, careful in the way of a large man who had learned to make his edges kinder. Life bent forward with the steadiness of a river. The foundation that had been a mason jar and a promise became crates on a hospital dock. On a bright, brittle morning, Tommy helped tug the lid off the first box. New plastic breathed a faint, sweet smell. Inside lay a small machine that hummed like a cat in a lap, a clear mask folded on top. The bank manager checked the forms, lined up the corners with his thumb, and brought the blue stamp down in one clean thud that made every person in the doorway exhale. Later that day, a toddler's chest rose and fell against that soft hum, and the room's air felt warm without more heat. Thunder wrote a letter on thick paper that carried the whisper of oil and road. He invited the town to a spring ride to raise more for the wing that softened hard days, and he promised an order that would satisfy engineers and beat cops alike. The mayor read the letter twice. She put it under glass beside the banner and called it a promise in ink, and the case made the simplest music when it clicked shut. Around town, people began to speak of the ride as if it had always been on the calendar, like the fair and the homecoming game and the parade that used to be only a parade, and was now also a history lesson in movement. Tom Bradley took the last boards from his windows and leaned them against a back wall. He ran his palm along the grain, the way a man apologizes to a good horse he has kept saddled too long. When he saw Tommy on the sidewalk, he came across the street with a paper sack. Inside lay a small hammer and a roll of bright tape. "For building good things," he said, and when Tommy held the tool, he felt its balance settle into his hand, like a decision he would like to keep making. He understood the gift. The town would not be boarding up. The town would be building. The hooded boy who had spoken wrong in the square began showing up at the hospital on Saturdays with a hairnet and a new kind of courage. He wheeled carts. He held elevator doors when hands were full and faces were wet. Once a rider in Detroit, Colors met him in the corridor and tipped his chin and tapped the boy's shoulder with 2 fingers, a small benediction that straightened his spine for the rest of the day. Agent Chen came through once more before the year folded. She wore a roadwise coat and the spare smile of someone who knows the work is both finished and never finished. In the town hall room, with the quilt watching, she briefed the council and the chief and the nurse and the bank manager. The trial would run far from here where paper runs long. The record would hold. Fear of an image is not evidence, she said again. Behavior is evidence. She slid a copy of her report into a folder with the foundation letterhead and asked Tommy if the rabbit in the story had come back yet. "Not yet," he said, and she almost smiled all the way. When the ground softened, they gathered at the oak for the capsule. The earth gave up a smell of leaf and iron. The plaque lay flush with the dirt, so mower blades would skim it without harm. Tommy had carried the canteen in his backpack, wrapped in soft cloth, the dent resting cool against his spine like a hand. At the lip of the open cylinder he held the metal in both palms. He did not speak. He set the canteen down on folded papers, and a copy of a ledger page, and a still frame printed from 2 lenses that had agreed on a single flash. The canteen rang faintly against the metal, a low bell that meant finished, and also begun. Razor placed 2 photographs beside it. In one he wore the sharp edges of a uniform from another life. In the other, he sat cross-legged on a hospital floor with a book in his hands, and 3 children leaning toward the sound of his voice. The space between the two felt less like a break and more like a bridge. The mayor slid in the cooperation plan that had grown from an emergency map, its margins clean where fear had been sanded smooth. Thunder cut a narrow ribbon from a chapter banner and fed it into the cylinder like a red vein. Dr. Williams added a list of names of children who breathed easier now, some with crayon hearts sketched beside them, because small hands had insisted their signatures belonged. The bank manager dropped in a stamp pad lid worn smooth by honest thuds. Nurse Patricia tucked a card that carried a single underlined clause. Which sound came first? Agent Chen pressed and twisted the seal. She wrote the date and hour in tidy letters and slipped the card into a clear sleeve. Razor touched 2 fingers to the sleeve, as he always did when the law made a shape both could respect. The ground received the cylinder with the soft sigh only children and trees notice, and a light snow began again, as if to bless the closed dark with quiet white. They drank coffee that tasted awake, and ate cookies that tasted of cinnamon and clean sugar. Mrs. Patterson fussed a napkin into Tommy's hand and pressed too long and too hard in the old way of people who make apologies with touch. He smiled because that was the right currency for the moment. In the hall, after a small ceremony, unfurled like a careful ribbon, the foundation charter lay on a wide table. The pen had warm weight. Thunder wore his first suit, like a man honoring the room more than himself, and somehow the cloth learned to belong to him. Dr. Williams signed, the nurse signed, the bank manager signed, the mayor signed, The chief signed, Agent Chen signed as witness for a department that sometimes felt too far, and now felt exactly where it ought to be. When the pen reached Tommy, it felt heavy until his father's palm settled short and steady against his shoulder, and his mother's fingers smoothed the paper. He wrote his name slowly, letters upright, as fence posts in new ground. Razor did not speak. He unrolled a small leather wrap and laid a plain chain with a blank tag on the table. For the ledger key, he said. The nurse looped the chain through the ring and fastened it at her neck, the key resting against her scrubs like a quiet heartbeat. The gesture pleased the bank manager more than any stamp could say. Evenings came earlier. The town sounded different in small, true ways. Hammers thudded in a friendly meter as boards turned into shelves and frame. A motorcycle ticked as it cooled. Not a threat, just metal remembering heat. Sometimes the reporter's voice floated from a living room, and it had learned to measure, not assume. Children pointed at leather and asked questions without fear already in their mouths. Men in colors moved like men who know they are seen and intend to be worth the seeing. Back home, the medal on Tommy's nightstand sat beside the small wooden cross his grandmother had given him, both dusted by the edge of his sleeve because care lives in small motions. He stood at the window and looked toward the oak, dark against a pale sky. Somewhere under that tree, the canteen waited with paper and a lid and a card that kept a single sentence safe for a future finder. He thought of the small silver tab at Razor's collar, quiet and private. He thought of the canteen's cold against a burned mouth. Two promises, one made and one kept, both sealed, both still speaking without sound. On the couch his parents laughed the right laugh, a low ripple that moved down the hall and softened its edges. The house breathed in its winter way, a slow settling in wood and nail. Tommy did not count heartbeats or sounds. He listened to the house and the laugh and the hum of a new machine somewhere across town and knew them as his right noises. He pulled the curtain closed and lay back and let his breath match the home. Spring would bring blacktop patched smooth, and a line of bikes that behaved like an answer to a question once asked in fear. Summer would bring chrome cooling in shade, while children traced reflections with jam-sticky fingers. Autumn would bring paper signed and stacked and filed and turned into equipment with real weight. Winter would come again and find them ready with warm rooms and clean ledgers, and a banner that did not flutter now because it did not need to. Outside the town hall, the glass cases held a letter and a line of cloth. Inside the hospital, the ledger key rested against a steady sternum and the stamp slept in its cradle. Under the oak, metal kept metal company. Above it all, quiet settled in the way. Quiet settles when the work is done well and still being done. Tommy closed his eyes and let the day fold around him. He thought of the ride promised in ink and the hammer waiting in his drawer, and the thread on the quilt tracing a path over underlined numbers. He smiled at nothing in the dark and felt the future step close like a friend. Just as signs in cold ink at its heart, this story is a quiet reminder that truth does not shout. It endure. Tommy 2,000. Riders speaks to the courage it takes to do what's right. When fear is loud and fairness is fragile, it's about the moment a single voice, honest, uncertain, yet unwavering, can cut through the noise of prejudice and rumor. Tommy's bravery wasn't in grand gestures, but in staying steady, in choosing compassion over panic, in holding on to what was real when others held on to fear. In life, we all face moments when it's easier to stay silent, to go along with what everyone else believes, even when our gut whispers otherwise. But silence in the face of wrong only teaches others to speak louder for it. Standing for what's right often feels lonely, but as the saying goes, the truth is like the sun. You can't hide it forever. This story reminds us that real strength comes from quiet integrity, that kindness backed by courage can change more than laws. It can change hearts. If this story moved you, take a moment to share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever faced a moment when doing the right thing meant standing alone? Hit the like button to support stories that make us think, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more cinematic tales that blend suspense, humanity, and hope. May your own days, no matter how uncertain, end with the calm Tommy found. A peace that comes not from the absence of storms, but from knowing you stood steady through them.